Hello everybody and welcome to the Sovereign Village project. I'm here at the 5-acre site where we're going to be building out the new home of Hollowtop Farms. And I wanted to talk about why I'm working towards no input farming and why I think that's a good idea for just about everybody. So the goal here is to not bring any inputs into the farm. Inputs meaning petroleum products, meaning machinery, animal feeds, compost, potting soil, fertilizers. I don't want to bring any of that onto this property eventually. It's going to take me some time to get there. But I think this is really important from whatever perspective you're coming from, whatever reason you're seeking to get back to the land and grow food, you should try to do it without inputs. If you're coming from an environmental perspective, of course it makes sense. If you're having to truck in anything, even if it's an organic fertilizer, you're still having to use petroleum products and fossil fuels to move that from one location to another, and you also don't know that that product is necessarily made or grown or mined sustainably. And so if you can reduce that, of course, from an environmental perspective, that makes sense. After all, no man knows the day or hour. We don't know how long this world's going to be here. Eventually entropy will get the best of it, but for the meantime, we better take care of it because we're about to all suffer. We already are suffering because of what our ancestors did to the soil, because of what we've done to the soil. We're all suffering in our nutrition. We're all getting sicker and getting cancer and things like that more because we didn't take care of the earth. We're paying for that. So we should stop and take care of this earth. That's totally a pragmatic perspective. If you're coming from more of a prepping perspective, of course, that's another good reason not to have inputs. If you have to rely on inputs, if you have a tractor, it's not going to do you any good if you can't access oil. And if you have to bring in animal feeds, what happens when that supply is disrupted? You're not really self-sufficient, are you? So really, why bother with a bug-out property? And so from any perspective that I can imagine, inputs, reducing or minimizing or completely removing inputs really makes sense. And so I wanted to explain what our idea is to not need inputs here. Of course, we're using back to Eden type methods or Ruth Stout methods for gardening for all of our annual beds. We're just mulching everything, and we need to generate a lot of compost. But with mulch and compost and manures, we can make all of the inputs we need. We're not going to fertilize our plants. We're just going to build good soil and grow whatever works in this soil. We're not going to grow novelties. We're going to grow what works with this land. And so all we need to do for inputs is just generate a lot of biomass, basically. And so what we're going to have here is chickens, ducks, and rabbits initially running on this land. And they'll be mostly in tractors. There'll be some free rangers. And they will generate all of the manure we need. Right now we have rabbits, and they already generate all of the manure we need. And they'll also process mulch, and they'll process compost and food scraps. Food scraps and things will go through a chicken coop designed specifically to generate mulch. We'll throw leaves in there, we'll throw food scraps in there, and they will go through and we'll throw old rotten logs. We'll have a worm bin nearby, and we'll have soldier fly larvae, and a lot of different sources feeding those chickens. But for a while, it's going to take us a while to get there. So for a while, we're going to be using poultry feed, rabbit feed, and hay, and a little bit of petroleum for one machine. We're running a lawnmower to process leaves, but that's about the only real fossil fuel we're using on this. Of course, there's exceptions for this being a new farm. We're going to be bringing in lots of new plants and seeds and things like that because we're establishing a new farm. But when things are up and running, eventually we'll really only have those 4 inputs, which is a little bit of fossil fuels for one task, organic hay from a local farm, and rabbit and chicken feed. The first thing we want to cut out of that are rabbit and chicken feed. So we're designing this property for that, to feed the animals. So we will have rings around every edge, every food forest edge or forest edge. We will have edible forage perennial trees planted. Things like maples, willows, mulberries can feed animals. They're packed with nutrition. They're way better than hay in a lot of cases. And so we'll be doing perennial forage for our animals, which means that we're reaching deep inside of the soil and accessing nutrients that have been sitting under there for so long and being underexploited because we farm on a 2-dimensional surface most of the time, and we really ignore what's under there. And so we'll be planting lots of forage trees that will generate a lot of that food for us. And then, of course, we'll be doing typical annual feeds. We'll grow buckwheat. We've found that does really well here. And we'll grow other basic grains in kind of small quantities because that's a lot of processing by hand. And we'll have things like soldier flies, and we'll have, of course, grass areas that will graze chickens and we'll graze the rabbits over. And we'll be supplying all of their food eventually. But we'll keep hay as an input because I have a really good hay source. It's a good local family that they do things really regeneratively. and they're really close by, so it's hardly any gas expenditure, and there's no middleman. So that input I'm going to keep around for a couple of years because I can easily bring that onto the land, feeling good about it, and I'm just adding quick biomass to the system, and I'm getting those manures made really fast so that I can kind of speed things up. Yes, I could build the system slowly using just the mulches from the forest and stuff like that, but this will speed things up, and it's a good input that I feel really good about. Right now I give it to the rabbits, and I just stuff it in the cage, because once it's soiled they won't eat it, but it's not a waste because then I have a great mulch. So they eat what they want, everything else becomes a mulch that's got all sorts of nice rabbit manure in there, and all sorts of goodies. So I'll continue to use that input, but eventually be weeding that out with my own grains and my own perennial forages. That will leave me with only one real input, which is fossil fuels to run a mower. And what that does is it chops these guys up, the big leaves. I obviously have a huge resource here of leaves. I can take some of the leaves from these trees and feel good about it. And I'm also going to be generating a lot of mulch I'll be planting nitrogen fixers all around and generate mulch off of that. But I need leaves for a mulch for this system. The problem is when they're really big, they don't work very well. For example, if you use fresh leaves in a garden, I've found often the leaf will blow over the seedling and kill it, whereas hay and straw doesn't do that. And so I have to chop up the leaves really finely to make them a usable mulch and to make them compost faster. And for that, I'm having to use a lawnmower and put it in bags and then empty it onto the garden. And so I want to remove that. That's the last piece of the puzzle. What I'm going to try doing is running them through a special chicken coop where I'll pile leaves really deeply, like about a foot deep, and let the chickens scratch through them. I'll throw the grain right into the leaves. I'll throw the food scraps into the leaves and let them scratch at them for a long time. And that might take that chicken labor and turn that into mulched leaves for me. So I'll keep you appraised of that project. But if we can solve that problem, this 5 acres within a year or two will be completely input free, and that's the goal. So I would love to hear ideas. If anybody wants to brainstorm some ideas about how they feed animals creatively, I know there's a lot of cool ways out there. Would love to turn this into a brainstorm session in the comment section. In the meantime, everybody, stay safe, be well, and happy homesteading.